Good afternoon and welcome to the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnerships webinar, A Forest Landscape Approach to Lake Habitat Protection by Dan Steward. I'm Joe Noner, the coordinator for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. And before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit of information about the partnership and logistics before we get started. The Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership hosts these lakes conservation webinars to share science, management, and outreach efforts of interest to our partners. You can keep up to date with our webinars by checking the webinar page at midwestglaciallakes.org. Webinars in this series will be added to our webpage along with other webinars of interest, with the goal of having 4 to 10 webinars a year. You'll notice that we've been having quite a few webinars recently, and that's because we set up a webinar blitz during these times where we all find ourselves working from home and at least myself going a little bit stir crazy, looking for additional information. Notifications for the webinars will be also provided through the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership's quarterly newsletter. You can sign up for that newsletter at our website, which you see here on the screen as midwestglaciallakes.org. If you'd like to share your experience or project results through a webinar like this, please reach out to me at nonerj@michigan.gov. That's also on the screen as we speak. For those of you unfamiliar with the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, we're a partnership of professionals and stakeholders focusing on conserving the over 40,000 glacially formed inland lakes across an 8-state region. Our mission is to protect, rehabilitate, and enhance sustainable fish habitats in glacial lakes of the Midwest for the use and enjoyment of current and future generations. And we define fish habitat very broadly to include water quality and connectivity and structural habitats and all of the other aspects. The partnership provides science for lake conservation, such as our conservation planner that provides information about every lake in the partnership, education and outreach to stakeholders and professionals through webinars, news releases, Twitter conversations, and the sharing of materials related to lake conservation, and of course funding for science, outreach, and education, and on-the-ground rehabilitation or protection projects through our Lakes Conservation Grant. This grant is released every year in August and provides about $250,000 to $300,000 for lake conservation projects that benefit fishes. A few logistics about today's presentation. It should last about 30 to 45 minutes and will hold the remaining time for questions. Participants will be muted during this webinar, so if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to submit them. I will moderate those questions and we'll all try to get to them all. You can see the question and answer function is on the screen here. It's this icon. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see it appear, and just click on that. You can enter in any questions that you may have for the presenters. If for some reason you have technical difficulties, or if you'd like to share this webinar with others that could not attend, we will post a video to the webinars page of our website within a week. I'll also email that link to everyone that registered for the webinar. Today's speaker is Dan Steward. Dan has worked for the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources for the past 36 years. He's worked out of the board's Brainerd office in the north central part of the state for 31 years. He's worked with counties, soil and water conservation districts, and state agencies on local planning issues over most of his career. Now, in the last few years of his career, Dan has focused on lake water quality protection, conservation easements, and private forest management. Dan is an excellent presenter and storyteller, and in my opinion, one of the most compelling advocates for watershed conservation to protect lakes. So I'm really looking forward to his presentation. Dan, the virtual stage is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. And I want to thank the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership for the opportunity to talk about a forest cover-based lake water quality and habitat protection strategy that we're using here in north central Minnesota. And a lot of my slides will be map-based and so on, and they'll often show the entire state of the map of the state of Minnesota, but our experience and most of our application has been in the north central part of the state. That north central area happens to be pretty synonymous with what we call the Upper Mississippi River Basin, a large part of north central Minnesota, and we'll see that as we get into the slides in a little bit here. A quick outline. I've got a couple slides of introduction, then slides 3 through 8 are the background, foundation, and science. Slides 9 through 14 are local water plans. Slides 15 through 29 are examples. And then the closing is slides 30 through 33. So that's a quick outline. This picture, this first opening slide here is a bend in the Pine River. This is north of Brainerd, and the Pine River watershed will be one of the main areas we'll be commenting on throughout. This particular stretch of the river here was currently protected recently through a wild rice conservation easement that is permanent, and that the cost of that easement to protect a half mile of the river here was $65,000, which we think is a conservation bargain, and that's one of the great benefits of working in what we call protection country, because of the limited ability of the land to be agricultural, land values are much lower. Of course, if you get into the lake shore, that's a different matter, but the lands away from the riparian corridor are generally much lower, and that's a very important factor. So moving on to the next slide, please. I think it's pretty well known. Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. It's on our license plate. Lakes are very important to Minnesota culture and our economy. Strong fisheries help drive that, of course, and good water quality supports strong fisheries. Full disclosure now, I'm a geographer. I'm a map guy, and even worse, I'm an old school geographer. That means pre-GIS. So I knew the only way I could survive in the modern world was to work with people who are about twice as smart as I am. And I've had the great fortune of being able to do that. We have partners that are just outstanding. And so these slides you're looking at, I don't think of as mine, they're ours, in that we put our heads together, and that's how we roll, I guess. So here, this photo, being a geographer, and this poor fellow running this gas station here with the map on the wall, can you imagine all the people coming in to ask him for directions on how to get to this lake or that lake? This is a northern Itasca County shot. Itasca County is one of the 2 counties in Minnesota that has over 1,000 lakes, greater than 10 acres in size. And so this map shows 30 or 40 lakes. There are 10 times that many lakes that are not shown. I guess the artists did the best they could, but they're trying to limit, I think, the people who are coming in just asking directions. And I'm sure it helps somewhat. Next slide, please.
Dan, we have a question for you that I think would make sense to interrupt you for.
That's fine.
The question is, what was the area in acres protected in the Pine River for $65,000?
That was about 60 acres.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, to the slide with the 3 maps of the state. And here it's just important to note, Minnesota is an extremely diverse state. We're right at the crossroads of the boreal forest from the north, the prairies from the west and south, and the hardwood forest coming from the east. And so there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the state. You can see ag land use pressures coming in from the west and south. And then that red spot on the map is the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. About half the state's population is in that red area, about 3 million people. And so there's a pressure also coming up, development pressure, often shoreline oriented, coming up from the metropolitan area. And so the middle map shows disturbance, and Minnesota's lost about 15 million acres of forest land historically. And you can see in the third map on the right, the black areas indicate converted lands, and then the yellow dots show impaired waters. So again, we have a diverse situation in managing our waters, just like the diversity of the state itself. outstanding waters and in the boundary waters in the extreme northeast part of the state, and then lots and lots of impairments in the shallower waters in the southwestern part of the state. So land values in that agricultural part of the state can run $8,000 to $10,000 an acre, and land values in the north central and northeastern part of the state typically are $1,000 to $2,000 an acre. So we have the primary input in conservation, the cost of land is certainly one of the primary inputs. Varies. We can do 4 to 5 times as much per dollar in the protection part of the state. That's a very important factor. Next slide, please. Protect the sponge. That's a quote from Pete Jacobson of DNR Fisheries. And Pete and his science has been absolutely fundamental to building a foundation that we could then work with local units of government to get built into their local water plans. So forests have a strongly moderating effect on watershed hydrology. They function like wetlands in that they slow water down a lot. In fact, most forest covers don't have any surface runoff. And especially when you've got sandy soils and gentle slopes that are so common in north central Minnesota. The stream courses, there are some impaired through channelization, but most are still natural. They're full of beaver. And so this is a very moderate watershed that is moving slowly. And so that all helps in putting water in the ground and not across the surface. So as we start to develop the watershed in that lower picture in the center there, the drawing, you can see we start to lose that groundwater component and convert more of that into surface water flow. And so porous forest soils absorb precip and deliver groundwater through clean water through groundwater. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but how do you get a photo of the groundwater influence on lakes? And so that picture in the lower left is actually our driveway here, and we've lived here for 30 years now. And so I just did the math this morning, 365 days, 30 years, 11,000 days. And that photograph of the hydrologic impact of groundwater on the lake was there one day in 11,000 days. And of course, I immediately jumped out of the truck and started taking pictures because we'd had a very still night in early November, cold, and with a dusting of snow. And I knew there was spring activity on the lake, but I had no idea how much. Now, keep in mind, this lake is a shallow lake. It's in the headwaters, and it's only 8 feet deep. And so there's really not nearly the potential for groundwater activity here that you'd see in a lake further down the watershed with, let's say, 80 feet deep. And so this is what's keeping our lakes going in high quality to a very great extent, and why, as we see too much development of the watershed, we start to see things change. Next slide, please. We have lots of methodologies for restoration type waters or impaired waters. We have monitoring parameters, the 303D list, TMPLs, et cetera, but not much for protection waters. And funders need to see process, prioritizing, targeting, just coming in and saying, we're the good guys from northern Minnesota and we want to keep the water clean. That doesn't cut it. We need science-based methodologies on the protection side. And that's, again, where Pete and Fisheries were so instrumental in getting us going in the right direction. So the U.S. Forest Service says that north central Minnesota is the most complicated land ownership pattern in the United States. County land, state land, federal land, tribal forest industry land, and then, of course, your private landowners. And so that's a very complicated landscape. And then imagine putting 5,000 lakes in it and how complicated that picture is. And so we need a simple system to deal with great complexity. Next slide, please. This is the heart of the work that Pete Jacobson and Mike Duvall and others did with Fisheries. And they compared phosphorus in about 1,200 fish management lakes. They compared phosphorus to watershed disturbance and found that there is a tipping point. It's about at 25% disturbance. Now, disturbance, of course, in the southwestern part of the state where you see all that red is one thing. That's an elimination of the prairie and conversion to cropland for the most part. The conversion in the northeastern part of the state is deforestation to either some form of urban, suburban, shoreline development, some agriculture, and that sort of thing. And so we see a sharp increase in phosphorus tends to spike at about 25% deforestation. And so this was huge. If we didn't have this background science work, we'd be pretty much dead in the water. Next page, please. Okay, when we say protection, what does that mean? Well, you can see at the bottom that because 25% disturbances are a major concern, then that results in the goal, a simple goal of let's protect 75% of the watershed to forested type covers. And how do we define protection? Conservation easements plus public waters, public land, county, state, federal, wetlands, and forest stewardship contracts. So when we say wetlands, we include wetlands because Minnesota has a very strong Wetland Protection Act, and it's very hard to mess with any amount of wetlands in Minnesota, and even then you're usually required to replace. Forest stewardship contracts, that's a program we call SFIA, and that is a state program, Sustainable Forest Incentives Act. So that allows landowners that are interested in putting their forest land into contracts. It's like CRP in the trees or in the forest. It's not permanent protection, but they vary in term from 8-year to 20-year or 50-year. That's the landowner's option. And as the term of the contract goes up, the price per acre they're paid does as well. Next slide, please. This slide, I could spend the whole time just talking about this slide, and it just shows that we keep building on top of previous folks' work and various components, both local and state, both research and so on. I would direct your attention to the second bubble on the left arrow, the green one. That's when the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment passed in Minnesota, that constitutional amendment dedicating 3/8% sales tax to habitat purposes and clean water purposes. There's also an arts component. That raised, pre-COVID-19, that was raising a total of about, for the habitat and the clean water side, about $220 million a year. And that sunsets at 25 years. I think we're 10 years into it now, or 12. So we're about halfway into the referendum, and you can see we're moving towards protection methodologies that are explainable to people, that they can get on board with, and that are balanced and also allow for development. Next slide, please. Okay, looking at the state map on the right, we call it One Water, One Plan. And the idea there was Minnesota's had county water plans in play. We started those about 1990. So for the last 30 years, counties have been encouraged to write water plans, but they were on a political subdivision, the county, and not a hydrologic basis. So now we're converting those over to watershed-based plans. And so you can see the light green color, those are the One Water, One plans that are done. And we do them on a major watershed basis. That would be a Huck 8 level. And so you can see the pine there that's circled in red, right in the center of the state. And then that black line around it, that's the upper Mississippi Basin. That upper Mississippi Basin is really very important and uniquely so to Minnesota. That is the source water for Minneapolis, St. Paul, and St. Cloud. And then I think it's 29 other rivers as you go downstream. In my opinion, That alone makes it easily the most important basin in the state, just because of its source water status. Really sets it apart. It also happens to be home, of course, to our beloved lake country. As you look on the left side now, we just you've got the local water plan in red there in the middle. Coming into that, Pollution Control Agency RAPS at the bottom. All kinds of water quality information is supplied to the local planning entity. GRAPS, the groundwater information, is supplied. Now LSP's landscape stewardship plan, something we developed here just in the last few years. If we're in forest country, well, let's see what we can summarize for forest-based information and how that might help the planners. So these are recommendations, this information coming in 3 arrows from the left. These are recommendations. And then the locals look at that and decide what their priorities are, and then it becomes policy. Very important. That's where we get policy. And I think this local element of delivering local support is the hardest piece, in my experience, to deliver. We can have all the good programs and policies at the state level and at the federal level, but if we don't have locals who have land use authority, we don't have enough. And so this is critical, we think. And so then we're just showing how northern Minnesota's economy is really based on tourism and timber. And so by protecting forests, we're actually supporting the two main legs of the local economy. And so we're not working in opposition or in tension with the local economy, but we're actually supporting it. We think that's pretty important. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned landscape stewardship plans. This just shows the Headwaters. Headwaters is the next watershed. It's in blue in the state map we saw previously. It's just north of the Pine and the Leech. So this is the headwaters of the headwaters. This is up to Lake Itasca where the Mississippi begins. And so we do a very focused, quick planning process. We write this plan and its recommendations at the state. We sit down with a few local folks. We do it very quickly. We don't want to suck all the planning oxygen out of the room that they'll need for writing the main plan. So we just real quickly put together some perspective from a forestry side of things. And so these are about 30 pages. And so far the locals are very interested in them, and this is starting to spread now. And now I think we're on about the next batch will be like our 5th and 6th of these. Next slide. The next 4 slides are from the Pine River Watershed, one plan. Okay, so, or local water plan for the Pine. So these One Water, One plans are developed primarily by the SWCD and the county. And other partners, many other partners contribute, lake associations, et cetera, interested citizens. And again, as I said, it's at a Huck 8 watershed level. Okay, we were particularly excited about the Pine because for the first time in Minnesota, there's a One Water, One plan, a local water plan, where forest protection is the centerpiece of a water plan. This is the first time it's happened. You can see it there at Goal 1. And it's all about let's move watersheds where we still can to 75% forest protection. Okay, and then as we look down there in the second red box, we can just see the top one is SFIA. Those are those forest contracts. The next middle box is conservation easements component, and then there is a fee title component too. Fee title, of course, isn't as common. It's more expensive and it's more politically sensitive, but there are times where fee title works for everybody, and then it moves forward. And that is a key place where we work with NGO partners. We don't do fee title, but the NGO partners, in this case, Trust for Public Land, has been very good at picking up these pieces, working with counties and so on, and then transferring them either over to the county if the county has the adjacent land, or to the state if it's adjacent state land. Okay, we're staying, next slide, please. A very important component that I don't have a specific slide for, so I'll just introduce it here, is PTM. And PTM is the guidance we've been given by the legislature and the leadership in St. Paul. Prioritize, target, and measure. If you want to access legacy funds, prioritize, target, measure. That's the name of the game. And so what we developed was, well, to us, prioritize means by a water resource or by minor watershed. To us, a minor watershed is a Huck 14. That's getting quite small. There are 5,600 minor watersheds in Minnesota. So I think the average would work out to about 10,000 acres. So that's the planning level. We like to say it's at the minor watershed level where the water world comes alive. Because all of a sudden you've got a wild rice lake, or you've got an important stream stretch, or you've got a high quality Cisco lake, or something there that says, hey, this might be a priority area. So we prioritize by water, and then we target by land. Okay, so once you've identified a priority minor watershed, then you target within that by looking at the parcels. So we call this drilling down into the minors. We also call it major in the minors. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. Is this, I think it's Pine River One Watershed, One Plan now. Prioritization is the slide we should be on. And this should have a line written, sketched vertically right below that little gray box at the top that says lakes with trend data. There should be a vertical line there, separating the green box from the stuff on the left. Okay, so the Pine River has 440 lakes, greater than 10 acres. It's a small watershed, but it still has 440 lakes. Of those, 95 have trend data, primarily SWCD-based.
Dan, can I stop you 1 second?
Yes, sir.
This is Joe. Do you want to be on the Pine One Watershed One Plan prioritization table? Or on
lake prioritization, yes.
The table?
Let me see. Yes, ISCO, the next, yeah, not the map, the table. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Do I need to back up?
I would start on the table just to orient people to
okay.
the slide.
So at the top, you can see here, we've got 400, well, it doesn't show it actually, but we've got 440 lakes, greater than 10 acres in this watershed. 95 of those have trend data. And they tend to be, of course, the bigger, deeper fisheries and popular recreational lakes. And they have lake associations, and that's part of the reason they have data. So there's 95 with data. So the trend data really drives this thing. And we see 20 are declining and moving to the left. They already have phosphorus enrichment. They're not impaired, but they have phosphorus enrichment. And so they're in what we call a BMP management mode. They need to focus on practices to drive down phosphorus. Okay, that's substantially different from the lakes, the 75 lakes on the right-hand side that are stable to improving in trend. And their management mode, they have the wonderful position of being able to focus on forest protection because they're ahead of the game still. And so this is PFM focus. And so the green boxes at the bottom just show vigilance lakes in dark green, greater than 75% forest protection already, protected forest cover. And then the other green boxes are just less than 50% protection and 50 to 75% protection. Another quote from Pete Jacobson is absolutely, I think, really useful. Priority is or should be at the intersection of quality and risk. So if we don't have something of quality, I'm not sure we have the luxury of worrying about the risk, and vice versa. So where you have both quality and risk, that's a good place to start thinking about priorities. And so these high quality Cisco lakes are of that are less than 75% are in that sweet spot. Next slide, please. This map just carries over the colors from the previous graph and is again part of the One Water, One Plan. And so you can see whitefish here right in the center of the yellow lake, that is at lower levels of protection. And then Pine Mountain in the upper left, that dark green lake there, that's past 75, that's Vigilance. Washburn in the upper right corner, that's also at 75, but if you look downstream a little bit, Roosevelt, outstanding lake, that's I think at about 70%. So this is an example of a priority lake. Pelican as well, the south center part of the map, very important, high quality, large, deep lake, not at 75%. Then the next slide, please. Then on this slide, we just are starting to convert and look more closely. We're drilling down into these priority miners that happen to have lakes, and we're starting to get at acres and costs now. Okay, and the estimated cost to move these lakes that are not in the yellow and the light green to 75% would be in the neighborhood of $6.7 million. And so in some cases, you'll see lakes can't get to 75% because they've already got too much disturbance. And so then a lower goal is set, such as the ones at 63% there, and another set at 50%, because these lakes are not likely to reach 75%. Next slide. Once prioritized, how do we target? Very important to the concept of changing scales. You know, from the basin at Huck 3 or 4 to the major watershed at Huck 8 to the sub-watershed at Huck 10, the minor watershed at Huck 14, and back the other way, from the 14 to the 10 to the 8 to, you know, and so on. And if you keep going through that a few times, it's pretty basic and just a very useful thing, because you have different observations at each of those different scales and things that you notice that are important. That picture on the right is the Little Pine River. I took that photo while ricing about 4 years ago, and that is wild rice in the background, and the Little Pine is known for outstanding water quality. So we hope to keep it that way. Next slide. So now we're going to convert to starting to look at examples. Our first example is a theoretical example. It's a real lake, but a theoretical example. How could these tools come together to work in a specific lake watershed? Borden is 1,000 acres. It's 84 feet deep, 7 islands, but the minor watershed has 10 lakes in all. And so you see some of the outstanding features there, and it's not at 75%. If I recall, it's 52 or 53. So here's a great example of risk and quality. That's Mille Lacs Lake in the background, you can see there, that big lake you see right in the center of Minnesota. And if you look closely at that funny looking guy in the lower right-hand corner, I think that's an 18-inch tulipy that's making that big sag there in that pike's midsection. And this was a fish caught in a tulipy net that was just fine and was released. He was just in superb condition. Next slide. So here's one option. We could just, if Borden's starting at 53%, as the needle indicates, we could just market to the largest landowners, these various PFM forestry options they have. If we did that, the shortest distance to 75% is those 22 landowners. So now you start to see the power of GIS, and how with GIS we can quickly convert into from a priority lake to a work plan. Next slide, please. Option 2 is we came up with a simple 3 criteria system. We call it RAC, riparian, adjacency, and quality. And we have a little fun with this. We rack for ROI, and for ROI, of course, is return on investment. So we want to return for each conservation dollar invested, if we can, the most quality we can get. So rather than just willy-nilly accepting people into the program, we concentrate marketing efforts on those that have high RAC scores. And so this first map just shows, if you look only at the first component, riparian. The dark blue goes to the water. Next slide. If you look at adjacency to public lands, because large complexes are generally better than small ones. So we want to take that into account. And now the red colors go next to the public land, which are crosshatched in this Borden Lake minor. Okay, so up to 3 points possible in each of those 2 criteria. Next slide. Now we're looking at quality. This is the wild card and very flexible. The first 2 are not very flexible. They either are or you aren't. But quality is a different matter. And this is where the locals can put their thumb on the scale and define it however they want. So the state's not defining local priorities. We're just trying to give them tools to help them protect what's important to them. And often it's the same thing that's important to us. Next slide. This should be rack 'em up, the composite map of Borden Lake. And so now you can see how the 3 mix together. Okay, next slide, please. Now again, you start to see the real power of GIS again. Landowner table with rack scores and costs. So they're sorted by acreage size on the left, but then that's not our only criteria. We also are looking for qualities, quality investments or return on investment. And so there's the rack score in the first box. And then on the right, the land value from the county assessor's office. 60% of land value is important because that tends to often be a conservation easement offer. Comes in at that amount, 60% of assessed value, land value. And then we look at cost per acre, and we can even look at cost per acre point. So you can see this is drilling way down now into the parcel, and you can see some are as cheap as $121 a point, and others are in the $300-400 range. So there's various ways here where it's all science-based, and you can defend why a particular person was given an easement offer and maybe their neighbor wasn't. So this puts staff in a better position, we think. Next slide. So they're trying to do this quickly. I don't want to take too much time. Keep moving. Let's look at a theoretical application of all these put together. So this is, we're looking at protection scenario easements. And you can just see Mitch Brinks here, our GIS guru, just put, let's say we got 8 clicks from 53% to 61 with landowners who wanted to do easements. And they're circled in the red ovals on the map. And that cost would be about $1.3 million. That's very close to what the actual cost would be. And that's one of the strengths of this. Funders see what they're getting and how long it's going to take to get there and what it'll cost. Next slide. Okay, now we're just looking at SFIA. In other words, those 8, 20, or 50-year forest contracts. They're a covenant that goes on the deed. And let's say we got 12 clicks from that. These are much cheaper. It isn't permanent protection, and that's an annual cost, so it's $103,000. But it was 12 clicks, taking us all the way up to 73%. And a very important component here is we try to stay off the blacktop because most counties' comprehensive land use plans says they want to build on the existing infrastructure. So we don't want to be putting conservation lands right on the existing infrastructure if we can help it. And so sometimes there needs to be a discussion there, but as much as possible, we stay off the blacktop where we think we've got better conservation values anyway. Next slide, please. Okay, now we added a fee title piece just to close it out. And let's say there is a scientific and natural area there at the south end of Borden Lake, about a half a section. And let's just build that out a little bit with those blue parcels. And that would cost about $770,000, and that would bring us to 75%. Now that's all theoretical. One more Borden Lake slide, I believe, and that is next slide, please. I apologize for how this slide looks. It's usually a sequential, one element coming up at a time, but if you focus on this is Borden Lake again. And if you focus on the right-hand side, the 33 million, that's the existing property value on Borden Lake. And if we build out the small tracts that are less than 20 acres, that are in the 25% that's not going to be protected, that's an estimated 17 million. If you then build out the rest of the 25%, it's a $64 million potential. And then let's say redevelopment, when grandma's $60,000 cabin turns into $1 million house on existing lands, there's some potential there too. So in this particular case, it varies by lake, but in this case, there's all kinds of room yet to grow the tax base and protect Borden Lake. Next slide. Another real important concept, the PFM Landowner Toolbox. This is just taking all the options that have been developed over the years by a couple of these are federal, but most of these are state. So you have forest stewardship plans on the left end, and then fee title on the extreme right. And so the lower costs and less permanence on the left, more costs and more permanence on the right. And so you can see we've got cost share, green box, tree planting, timber sales, things like that. SFIA, those forest contracts would be in the orange, conservation easements and fee title on the right. So these are the range of options that are available, and we just follow, and this all operates under a very important concept of landowners choose. That's politically very important, I think, and folks really like to see that we're just kind of organizing things, the existing options, which could be very confusing, and then a local government or a state person goes out and meets with landowners that are interested in conservation, and it just helps them decide on how much conservation is right for them. Totally voluntary. Next slide, please. Implementation success story. So this one isn't theoretical. This is real. And lake funding for easements has trailed river funding. The river projects just got out in front on this referendum funding business. And so that's why we're going to a river-based system now, for an example. So Mississippi Headwaters Board, MHB, that's an 8-county joint powers board in north central Minnesota. And their purpose, established in 1980, their purpose was to protect the first 400 miles of the Mississippi River. Very unique, I believe, nationwide. So you can see here with our GIS work on this Huck 14 that's circled and is orange, and this is just north of Brainerd here, right, just a few miles from where I live. 37% is where they started with protection in the minor watershed. In over 2 years, we were able to move it to 71. Now, we're not going to be able to duplicate that probably very often, but I don't know if it was beginner's luck or what, but next slide, please. Funders want to see you move the needle. So I mentioned PT, prioritized by water, target by land, measure by needle. And so this is, we're starting at 37 here, as you can see. Okay, now we've zoomed in on that minor watershed with the map. So first in 2017, there was an acquisition there, fee title. Trust for Public Land did that. It's that green parcel you see in the lower part of the map. Great Big Bend of the Mississippi River, all forested. They wanted to move to Florida. They didn't want an easement, and they didn't want to get into SFIA. They wanted to sell. There was state land adjacent, so that piece went to the state. And that was 9 clicks. Okay. So now we're getting the programs and the partners working together here, state agencies, local units, NGOs, everybody. The next project was an easement. And then we got 5 clicks out of that, up to 51%, and that's the pink parcel in the upper part of the map. And now we're tying in to existing public lands. And that's, those blocks there are 40s. So that piece, it looks like, is nearly a mile of river frontage, that pink piece, and that's an easement, okay? Then the heavy hitter here happened to be SFIA, these contracts, and that's one landowner there, had a large piece of hunting land. And so they were interested in SFIA, 15 clicks there. Then one more fee title, had the green piece with the 440s, and that brought us to 71%. Okay, the Mississippi River, now pulling back a little further, Mississippi River started this project in 2017. They were at 61.5% protected of the first 400 miles of the river. There's 2 banks, so that's 800 miles of shoreline. Very large project. They started at 61.5%. When they get through with their existing funding, now phase 4, they'll be at between 67 and 68%. So we figured if we can move the needle pretty fast on a huge project like this, we can probably do lakes too. Next slide. Now, starting to wrap up, this just shows funds flowing into north central Minnesota. I mean, there's funds going to all other parts of the state too, so I don't mean to say this is even more money than is going elsewhere. I haven't looked at that. It probably isn't because the dollars go so far up north, you don't need as many dollars. The heavy hitter there that you see at the top, ACUB, Army Compatible Use Buffer, is a very unique project protecting Camp Ripley, a military training facility, 53,000 acres of state land right on the Mississippi River. And so the Guard is very interested in protecting this from encroachment, development. And so conservation and military training go hand in hand here, and they pulled in about $60 million for that project, but about 50 of that is federal. And so you can see the other projects there that are starting, and at the bottom you see the lakes funding is starting to happen with that project at the bottom. Next slide. This just shows the poster that we used in front of the council when we went for that lake funding. And it's just, it's a habitat fund after all. So we tried to show a walleye on the left and a big buck on the right. And then on the right-hand map, we prioritized by minor watershed. The green are the priority minors in the leech and the pine. So we teamed these 2 majors together. And you can, those are the priority minors. And then the middle maps, you see targeting down to the 40. And so they liked this and recommended it for funding. Next slide. This is just showing an outreach piece we're using. This is still a development, and it's for materials or inserts for land use, forest stewardship planning that goes to landowners. So some landowners just want their check for their contract. Others are very interested in this stuff, and so we wanted to give them something they could begin to comprehend and see what they're involved in. And this will be interesting to see if what they think of Watershed 101 and protecting forests and protecting waters and the 25% and so on. Next slide. This is my last slide in closing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. This lake, we took this photo about 5 years ago. This is Osawatomie, high quality Cisco Lake in Crow Wing County here, about 20 miles from where I live. Beautiful lake, beautiful forested watershed, right? But you know what? Only 35% protected forest. So this particular lake, which is very high quality, is vulnerable. It's not far from very well improved major highway arteries. And so the pressure from the Twin Cities just seems to get closer and closer. And if we just let the clock go for about 50 years, I would say lake and its watershed will be all chopped up into little pieces if we don't try to intervene a little bit. So that's my closing slide. Thank you again for the opportunity. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thanks so much, Dan. This is Jo Lattimore from Michigan State University, and I'm going to be facilitating the last little piece of our webinar here. Remember that there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for Dan, he's going to stay on for a bit to answer any questions you type into that box. We do have a few questions in the box right now, Dan, so I'm gonna start asking you some questions.
Okay.
All right, the first question is, How does the HUC 8 or HUC 10 watershed plans translate to individual lake watershed protection? Does the 2575 land protection apply?
Yeah, great question. What we found is we go all the way down to the HUC 14. Other parts of the state in their watershed planning that don't have as many lakes, they're going down to the HUC 12, which is a larger watershed. But when you've got a lot of lakes, we think it works better to go all the way down to 14. So those average about 10,000 acres. So the 14 is just a convenient container for whatever lake you want to protect. And so you start up to 8, that's the HUC 8 or major watershed as we call them, is the total plan basis. And then you start screening through your lakes, and you use the HUC 10 maps to do that. You'll notice certain things at the HUC 10 level, and then usually the locals know what their best lakes are and why. And then you get good technical assistance coming in from the agencies and so on to confirm those or challenge them. And so through that process of discussion and data, you just start drilling down into the minors, deciding which lakes are obvious priorities, and then which ones, well, maybe they're not as obvious, and you do more discussion on those. And pretty soon you end up with, and then also you're working from the other end. You're eliminating a lot of the watershed, at least temporarily, that is not your concern right now. We can't do everything at once. There isn't that much money or time. And so where we don't work or where we agree not to work is just as important as where we do work. And so you're kind of working on it from both ends. Does that help at all?
I think it should, yes. Thanks, Dan. The next question, if you cannot address a block of private land, does working to restore forest to the riparian zone help you meet your needs? And how would you fit that into your scoring?
Yeah, for one of the pieces in this that's underaccounted for, difficult to account for, I think, and I think this is what the question relates to, is BMPs, are a lot more difficult to measure. You're talking pounds of phosphorus now, rather than just acres. We have the great luxury and protection of just counting acres, and that's quite an advantage. And so, yeah, if anybody can convert reforest riparian areas, that's all to the plus. And so I guess I would just say over time, those lands would go from being disturbed to being forested and hopefully protected forest.
All right, great. The next question, how does forest disease like oak wilt or invasive species impact your plans and protection targets?
At this point, it doesn't, because I think, I like to use the example of, as far as water quality and or hydrology goes, the lake probably doesn't care if it's old growth white pine or if it's box elder. It's forested. And it's just that interception of the precipitation and the easing it down into the ground and so on that makes the difference. And so SWCDs and agencies are very concerned about invasives, certainly, but in terms of the water quality aspect, they're going to count as protected if they're protected, even if they have buckthorn. Does that make sense?
It does to me.
They certainly need more work, but for this exercise, they would count as protected.
Okay, another question we have, is there a break point where the % agricultural land in a watershed makes easement or protection unfeasible? I am from a predominantly agriculture area of corn and soybeans.
Yep, that's a great question. We're just getting this methodology extended out now into the transition part of the state, where we're encountering more agricultural lands. And one thing we just stumbled on the other day was when we get into minor watersheds that are heavily disturbed, and you're not going to make it 75% or even close, then maybe it makes sense to switch to a riparian approach. because those riparian forests, and if you have forests in those areas, maybe you're only 10 or 20% forested in some of those watersheds. It's very likely those forests are on the streams. And so if you can go in and do a riparian easement there or forest contract of some sort or another, you can still do a lot of good. So you have to be flexible and adjust your goals as the basic geography of the region changes.
All right, it looks like we have, we have a quick comment that I'll just share with you, Dan. This looks like great work in moving the science to plans and actions by government and landowners. And I would agree with that. That's a nice observation of this work. And then there's one more question. So remember, if you have a question, type it in the box now before we wrap up. The current question that we have in our list is, are any of your local lakes simply decorative? That is, they look good without decent fish or wildlife habitat.
I kind of live on a little lake like that. If I understand the question, I live on a little 80-acre lake, and as I said, it's only 8 feet deep. But its shoreline is almost entirely natural now and forested, and it's just a great little resource. It's beautiful. It's quiet. There aren't boats tearing around. We have the trumpeter swans all the time. And this one happens to be quite a fish producer too, because it's a rearing pond. So these little resources, I call them the glorified beaver ponds, the small lakes, are great resources to individual landowners. There's so many lakes that we have to focus our public dollars on the ones where we get the most public good. And so this is not a tax-based lake. The big lakes with the high quality shoreline and great fisheries and things, their tax base is very, very strong. These lakes are one of the major drivers of property tax in all of northern Minnesota.
All right, well, that wraps up all of our questions for today, and we're nearing the 3 o'clock hour here in Michigan, 2 o'clock in Minnesota. So it's time for us to wrap up. I want to again thank you, Dan, for joining us today for this very interesting presentation. And I also want to remind everyone who's on today that we are recording this webinar, and in about a week or perhaps less, we'll have it posted up on the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership webpage you can go back and view it again or share it with others. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.